Thank you. I have to say I was really disappointed I couldn't be here this morning. Last minute, the mayor asked me in Chicago, and when the mayor asks me to do something, I always say yes. It's my boss to be part of a discussion on the future of cities through the lens of neighborhoods, and I was thrilled that libraries were a big part of that discussion. So I spent the morning talking about libraries in a context of community setting, and I'm really excited. Although I don't actually do a lot of public speaking, I'm actually a pretty quiet guy and I keep to myself. I'm always happy to talk about libraries, and any opportunity I have, I take it to do it. And and the reason I do is I think about, the reason I continue to work in libraries is I think that libraries have an extraordinary staying power and are really masters of evolution in a lot of ways. And we think of libraries, I think in some cases, as pretty traditional institutions, but in fact, not only do they have radical missions, they have evolved while keeping that mission strong over time. Over hundreds of years, we're still essential to a healthy and competitive city, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm not going to talk about today is one aspect of libraries that's still very important today, and that's books. And not because books are obsolete. I don't want you to get that impression from me, or that they're less important. But because they're what most people think about when they think about libraries. And I assume that most of you in the room, having looked at the attendee list, that you're familiar with the ways that libraries are linked to the print format. So I'm not going to talk about that, but I am going to talk about the future of cities and how libraries are already and will continue, in my view, fuel success in cities in a really important way. Specifically, I'll talk about cities in the knowledge economy. We'll talk a little bit about libraries and how they're more relevant than ever. And then we'll be talking a little bit about libraries, their mission, and how they can be leveraged to help cities in this knowledge economy. So when I think about the knowledge economy, and I know this is a term that we hear a lot, the 21st century economy essentially is the knowledge economy. And it's an economy where innovation is prized, where the might of our workers' minds actually trumps the mettle of our machines, and cities, dynamic, shifting, and growing, are nimble and driving this new economy. So cities are really an important part of this. The knowledge economy, or this term, was really coined by Peter Drucker in 1969 and gained significant popularity, obviously, in the 21st century, and refers to this movement away from the agricultural-intensive economies to the away from agricultural economies to this sort of knowledge and global information economy. Global economies where competitive advantage come through knowledge workers who drive innovation and invention. It's widely known that's the social and economic globalization that's making the world more uniform or flat is now at the center of these economies. And so in short, really successful cities are in fact superseding national governments in this new age of a knowledge economy, and they are the economic drivers. So there's really two pieces of that. Cities are a really important part of how we think about the future success of our countries, as well as how we perform in a flat global and knowledge society. So big cities are an important part. In fact, we know that today, about half the world's population live in cities, and by 2050, that number will grow to 2/3. And as cities become the incubators for invention and compete in this borderless frontier, they must ensure that the residents are informed, creative, entrepreneurial. I mean, all the things that we've been, I'm sure you've been talking about today, and innovative. People are are lifelong learners, and really able to absorb and utilize new information. This is critical to the success of our cities. And so how will cities find success in this new knowledge era and compete? So cities must have administrators and business leaders and citizens who have greater technology skill and capacity is one piece. Another is cities that are more entrepreneurial and innovative. So people who understand what that means to be entrepreneurial and innovative and taking that approach. And also people who are creative and better informed. And this is according to the Committee on Digital and Knowledge-Based Cities, and there's lots of different studies out there on the future of cities. But for today's purposes, really want to talk in these three different frames about how we think about the future city and how might the library have a role within that. So basically, creativity is key, and how informed, creative, and innovative we are within our cities will predict our success in this new frontier. And for most of us, I hope, in this room, that isn't really new information at this point, that we know this to be true. The question is, how do we get there? And I think many folks in this room are leading those discussions and the institutions that are taking there. It's also where I think libraries come in. Libraries have been and continue to be in the knowledge business. So a lot of people think of us in a format business, in the book business, and it's a really important part of our business, but we're really in the knowledge business. And part of our history, it's part of our history, it's part of our future. It does not, however, mean that we've been static or unchanging institutions, but it's a really important part. In fact, over the years, libraries have evolved to support knowledge creation and dissemination in many, I think, interesting and relevant ways over time. My organization, the Chicago Public Library, is 140 years old, and I'll get into the data in a minute, but we are enjoying today record use over that 140-year history, and it's not by accident that you're around that long without doing a little bit of evolution. But I think what is unique is that we haven't changed our core mission over that time. It's just the way that we performed against it. So I think it's an interesting way to think about libraries. So for hundreds of years, libraries have really been evolving and changing. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Egyptians, but I must point out that the Royal Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BC, along with the other libraries of that time, were a sign or a symbol of an empire's power, wealth, and reach. And within the United States, many people think about Benjamin Franklin in certain contexts, obviously the framer of the Constitution and a champion of this idea around public education, but he believed that great libraries were at the center of our democracy and our competitive future as a nation. And it was a big idea in his mind to take the knowledge that was sort of stored in the ivory towers of institutions and in people's homes and make those available, that knowledge available to the public. And public libraries, in his mind, were places to connect and build a community around their interests. Franklin also talked about libraries were much more about they were as much about experimentation with ideas as they were about sharing those ideas through books. In fact, one of the things I think is great if you read some of Franklin's work about his experiments, this sort of first American library in many people's eyes was founded by Franklin, and in addition to storing all these materials that were sharing the knowledge of the day, it was also where he did a large amount of his experiments, and it was a very public space where we saw the leading technology of the day being experimented and played with within a public library setting. So in short, people have been lining up for libraries for a long time. They're going to continue to line up for libraries, I'm hoping. But really, in fact, libraries, as I mentioned before, are seeing an increased demand and are actually valued more today than they have in any other point in our history. And I think that's a really important point. I'll give you a little bit of data on Pew Research Center, actually I think funded through the Gates Foundation, recently in 2013 did a survey of Americans and their views and values around public libraries. And 95% of Americans believe that public libraries play an important role in a person's chance for success. They also similarly found that Americans believe that libraries promote a love of reading, that libraries also improve a community's life. And think about a library in every neighborhood in our cities in many cases. Also, Americans believe that libraries provide services that are hard to find elsewhere. And something to keep in mind when we think about public libraries in particular, these services are free. And so when we think about the world that we live in today and the cost of so many things, what you find in a public library is free, and it's a really important part of our mission to level the playing field and access for all. And it's what makes, I think, us extraordinary in this new age of information. So following these results, actually the Atlantic published an article comparing the Pew Research Center study with Gallup, Huffington Post, and some other studies that were done. They actually found that public libraries had a higher approval rating than Congress, which right now is not doing so great. Also journalists, which don't do much better than Congress. There's a few others that I didn't include, such as the president. But also baseball and apple pie, and public libraries seem to do better. No, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, right? I mean, this isn't a scientific study, but it's hard to dispute the fact that public libraries are among our most trusted institutions. And they're trusted for a reason. And they're among our most valued institutions. And so the question is, how do we leverage the value, the deep history. How do we take this and use it to make our cities and communities stronger? We actually tested this in Chicago. We didn't trust the Pew study. So we actually, in 2014, we used the Gallup customer engagement survey, which is, for those of you who do this kind of thing, it's the gold standard for customer service surveys, particularly in the private sector industries. And we found similar results. We had 30,000 people complete our survey, roughly 1% of Chicago's population, and about, I guess, about 3% of our user base. And similarly, people said they'd recommend the library to a friend, which was good news to us. They said that they use the library monthly, which was interesting in our sampling. This was a sampling of library users. They also gave a high satisfaction rate overall for all services, so they, generally people are pretty happy. And also said that the library was important in their lives. And so I saw these numbers, I was like, well, we could make some of those a little higher. The Pew study had a lot of 90s and 80s. And actually what I thought was interesting, the consultant that we brought in to do this work, I mean, when they came and produced the data for us, like, you won't believe this information. And it turns out that a 60 by those standards is considered, and any of those is considered like the top that you can get. So Apple is an example. They're always shooting for a 60%. So pretty good. So, Chicago libraries, not so much to pat ourselves on the back, but actually Chicago libraries are typical in the minds of our citizens and with other libraries around the country. And again, the question is, how can we use that value that we already have in our communities? How can we use that status that we have in our communities? This is just a slide. Our mayor talking about 5 things he's got to do in Chicago. Well, public libraries was on the list, so we were happy to see that. As was public education, public safety, public parks, and I think I missed the other one. So I wanted to share, and we're going to get into libraries, a few examples in a minute, but I did want to share with you some data. And again, I do this in part because, although I know I'm among friends of libraries in the room, and I suspect there are some librarians, often people forget how libraries as institutions are used. Often people forget how museums are used if they're not using them themselves. And so I'm going to out myself, so to speak, as someone who's not a regular attendee at public sporting events. But I'm very aware, living in Chicago, that sports are a big part of people's lives. And so I don't forget the fact that while I may not be a regular attendee at sporting events, I know that many of my friends and neighbors are. So that doesn't mean that they're not valuable. It just means that I personally am choosing not to use them. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have in public libraries and museums and others, is that sometimes people look at their own experience and they think, if I don't use it, nobody's using it. And that really, frankly, just isn't the case. So 11,000, that's the number of Starbucks in the United States. 16,000, that's the number of U.S. public libraries here in the United States. And just another side fact about Chicago, we have 40 Starbucks. We have 100 McDonald's, but in part because we're the land of McDonald's. We have 80 libraries. So again, people think, oh, libraries should, turn into cafes. Well, in fact, we have a penetration that envies most coffee shops and fast food chains around the United States. 218,000. This is the number of people who attended a major U.S. sporting event last year. 1.3 billion, this is the number of people who went to the movies last year, and 1.4 billion is the number of people who visited a public library last year. So just to give you a sense, we're not sort of sitting on our laurels. This is a historic time of use, and people really are using us and valuing us. In Chicago, we have 80 locations I mentioned before. We have 50 of these locations where we have computer tutors. They're called cyber navigators, where they help people one-on-one with computer instruction. So an important point as I get a little further in the conversation. 250, this is a number of sites where you can get access to a computer in the city of Chicago. So again, 80 of those locations are the library. Roughly 100,000, 98,000, this is the number of computer tutoring sessions that we offered last year in Chicago. 1 million, that's the number of active users that we have in Chicago. 1.5 million, that's the number of Wi-Fi sessions that we offered last year. And what's interesting about this number is it's doubled every year over the last 5 years, and we're on track this year to double that number again at the end of 2014. Incredible demand on our Wi-Fi infrastructure. Close to 3 million, this is the 2.8 million, this is the number of computer sessions that we offered last year at Chicago Public Library. And 11 million is the number of people who walk through our doors. And again, gives you a sense of roughly close to 1 million people visit the Chicago Public Library every month. So in short, people are still lining up for libraries. They just look a little different. And And again, to summarize, they're among the most trusted institutions we have. Some people say they might be better than apple pie or baseball. But given all that, how can we actually use this incredible resource that we have to make our city stronger in this new world of a flattening knowledge economy? And this is kind of where we get into the meat of a few examples. The question of how might we then use libraries to build technical capacity and skill? How might we use libraries to support entrepreneurship and innovation? And how might we use libraries to be a catalyst for creativity and learning within our cities? And I have a few ideas. We've been playing with this in Chicago. And when we think about providing access to knowledge and information and experiences, it's fundamental to what a public library already does. It's already core to our mission. Broad access empowers people to explore their interests, to achieve their learning goals, to find employment, start a new business, and improve and contribute to their communities. And that's really the sweet spot for us in libraries. Increasingly, that needs to be done in a digital setting. And today, many people within our cities have limited access to and are not digitally ready. This is a map of Chicago. This map is not unlike maps that you would see in other cities around the United States. The red is not good. 32% of Chicago residents do not have broadband access at home. Close to 20% don't have access to internet at all. This number is, and this is in certain neighborhoods in our cities. We have some neighborhoods in our cities where broadband is much higher, more closer to 60 or 70%, but still this is a really troubling number in an increasingly digital world. And if we want to be competitive as a city and as a country, these numbers need to get sorted out. Tools and technology access is even lower in economically disadvantaged communities, and again, this is a trend across the United States. And closing the gap is linked to the future success of our competition. So we must increase digital skills, we must increase access, we must increase broadband adoption. And while the library is already a really big part of this, so we're in every one of those communities, 80 communities across the city, the largest provider for you to open access in the city. And in our view, that isn't enough. And we think the library can have an even bigger impact. And so we're asking that question. Libraries are already the largest provider of internet and computer access in the city, and demand is growing. Given this penetration, we're asking how might we leverage this even more? How might we build digital skills, increase access, and support broadband adoption? This is a photo from the Seattle Public Library where I worked a long time ago. Their brand new library, but again, it doesn't matter what city you're in, Chicago, San Francisco, Seattle, rural America, urban America, people still are trying to get online. So here's a few things that we're playing with. One, about 6 months ago, the Knight Foundation, they have a challenge called the Knight News Challenge. And with it, I think they do it twice a year. They ask a big, bold question, and people respond. And the question a few months ago was, how can we strengthen the internet for free expression and innovation? And so we tossed in our hat along with a couple hundred other folks, and we're surprised, because we're not a Knight city, and Knight isn't really a big funder of libraries, that we, along with 2 other libraries, so 3 libraries actually, were winners of the Knight News Challenge. 2 of them were Chicago and New York, around really the same experiment, and that was an experiment that we're launching in a couple of months to lend hotspots. So it's kind of a fun question, again, how can we extend digital connectivity into neighborhoods? Those hotspot lending program will allow people to check out the internet and take it home. There'll be additional classes that teach people how to use these tools along with laptops and other digital tools. But it's one example of going deeper into our neighborhoods. On the other end of the spectrum, the tech spectrum, we have been exploring many new questions around access and learning beyond just the basics of being connected and having, being connected, getting on the internet and using a basic productivity software. Exposing students to coding from an early age helps demystify, we think, an area that can be intimidating. It breaks down stereotypes in computer scientists as being boring, which I know none of us think that they are. Many of my great friends are computer scientists. Some say that programming actually is highly creative and is an important part of how we might stimulate the minds of young people. And studying it can help improve problem-solving abilities as well as equip students with world-class transformation around technology. And it was for these reasons that we thought, if coding is such an important idea to expose young people to, and we know that in the classroom this is also an important idea that as early as elementary school, and if you look outside the United States, many countries are formalizing this education, how might we support access and exposure to those digital skills? And so when we were approached by a group of teachers and basically saying, hey, we want to teach these skills in the classroom, how can you help? We started lending out these things called Finch robots. These are a very simple tool. As young as an 8-year-old can learn the fundamentals of computer programming. You can actually learn one of, I think, half a dozen, 6 or 7 computer programming languages on this. I even did it myself and was able to make it blink and talk and drive within about 10 minutes. And so we're now checking these out of our libraries and providing tools for coding classes and programs either within the libraries or allowing these kits to go home to schools. And so again, it's a question of how might we use the ability of the library to check stuff out to expose people to leading ideas of the day through tools, potentially, as opposed to just through materials. Another example of this, and make it fun, is a project that we're doing related to robots and others, is a partnership with the Northwestern University Office of STEM Education. They've developed a program called Fuse, which is a self-directed learning system that allows kids to learn at their own pace a variety of different types of technologies and tools. So whether it's the fundamentals of engineering, computer programming, graphic arts, self-paced types of learning modules. And so we're working with Northwestern to prototype and experiment that work within our branch libraries. Those are just a couple of examples. On the question of how might we support entrepreneurship and innovation, Chicago, along with many other cities, and this is, you'll see this as a trend, I guess, when I talk about Chicago's libraries, is that it's really important to us that to keep our mission consistent, that we don't change the mission, but the way that we perform that mission changes with the way our city changes. In public libraries in particular, it's really important for us to understand where our city is in a given moment in time and where our city is heading. And in Chicago, along with many other city and urban centers, is undergoing a rapid transformation. Once Chicago was once based, our industries were primarily focused around manufacturing and service industries. We're now quickly becoming a hub for the growing information and idea industries. Actually, the tech sector in Chicago is the fastest growing sector in the Chicago area. For those of you from the Bay Area, we didn't beat you this year, not even close. But we are in the top 3 or 5 in terms of the growing tech sectors in the United States. And it's a really important part of our city, and it's also part of a strategy. So from starting a small business to finding jobs, growing small businesses and entrepreneurships, how can we as a library support this type of this experimentation? One project that we prototyped just about 2 or 3 months ago was a project with a new company called Public Good Software. They're a tech startup in Chicago. They were developing technology for nonprofits, and they were looking for office space. They were also a pretty fancy bunch of tech folks that came out of the Obama for America campaign, and we thought, hey, we can provide you office space in exchange for offering classes and open office hours for tech startups in Chicago. And we just did it as an experiment. What we found is the demand far outweighed what these guys actually were trying to start a business. So we weren't able to meet the full demand, but this has led now to a discussion with 1871, which is a tech startup incubator in Chicago, as well as other business incubators in Chicago. Is how might we use the library's place to support businesses, provide people access to those who are actually forming businesses on the ground today as a way, basically the library is a platform to help spur business within our city. And we're making some progress in that area. Another piece of where our city is going is advanced manufacturing is a growing sector in Chicago, and in fact, Chicago has a plan for economic growth and jobs, and it has 10 strategies. The first strategy is to be a leader in advanced manufacturing. That's the very first strategy, and the plan was launched about 2 years ago. And so when we saw that, we asked ourselves the question, well, what is advanced manufacturing? And so for those who haven't come in contact with 3D printing or 3D technology or other tools within advanced manufacturing, it's actually quite difficult. I don't know if you've ever tried to describe a 3D printer to somebody before. It's really difficult to describe it. It's much easier to just show it. And so it led us to a grant, a federal grant that allows us to build an advanced manufacturing space within the Harold Washington Library. It was intended to be a 6-month pilot. We put 3D printers, CNC milling machines. We saw jewelry makers and artists and scientists and students come into the space. And then we were going to close it down after 6 months. It was just an experiment. But what we found is that this was a really important space for the business community. And if nothing more, then they really liked the idea of people in Chicago without zero barrier to access, having access to these tools, seeing how they work, and if they found interest in them, going off and taking courses. We now are feeding into advanced manufacturing courses out of this space. So we went to close the lab. Motorola Mobility came to us, literally just came knocking on our door and said, hey, we heard this was a pilot. We're like, yeah, we've had 30,000 people come through the doors in this first 6 months. Over 4,000 people completed a class, but it was just an experiment. Like, well, how much does it cost to keep it open? We think this exposure is so important that we just want to pay for it. And so we're like, well, this is what it costs. They're like, great. Wrote us a check, and we're going to continue doing this work. But I think it's an important point that public libraries connecting with the business community, public libraries supporting the business ecosystem in this moment in time in Chicago is really important. Now, whether or not libraries need to be the advanced manufacturing hub for the city, probably not, that there's probably better places in the private sector for you really to, within Chicago, to do this. But I think it's an important point to think about libraries as an on-ramp for learning. In this case, as an on-ramp for learning about some of the emerging tech of the day. It's not just about getting online and connecting to the internet. So the question around how might we also be a catalyst for learning. There's a survey a recent survey that came out about 1,500 leading CEOs from around the world, and the number one thing that came out of that survey was creativity was identified as the single most important thing for success in their companies. This is probably not new to most of us. Probably read the study. Yet traditional education, as we know, can be isolating. It can be stifling, and it can actually kill creativity. And I know that many of us, certainly in this room, are trying to find ways to make that not the case. But even still, in many parts of our education system, it still is the case. And as we look across cultures and backgrounds, this urge to be playful is natural. It teaches us about taking risks. It teaches us how to be creative. While different cultures are beginning to recognize, certainly in the US and outside, creativity should be one of the most important things that we prioritize in our society, we're just starting to understand what it is and how to do it and how to support it. Libraries, museums, and other institutions that operate on these fringes of less traditional forms of education are one of the, I think, greatest opportunities we have to experiment with how to do this well. And given the informal, interest-based setting, specifically of libraries where I work, I just think that we're an ideal place to experiment. So with that in mind, there's a few examples. Some of you may be familiar with a pilot that was launched in 2009 called UMedia in Chicago at the Chicago Public Library, supported through the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. This work specifically looked at excuse me, how young people are living and learning with new media in a variety of settings, at home, after school programs, and online spaces. It introduced the idea of supporting kids as part of their social and learning networks for the first time. It's pretty groundbreaking research, and it's now being replicated in 30 cities around the United States and becoming one of the standards, gold standards of how you engage teens. And so this is an example of work that we're doing in Chicago. In fact, we've spread this work now to 11 libraries in the city, and we're continuing to expand that work. And we continue to explore how we can support interest-driven learning through peer networks using this model and the research of Mimi Ito. And we think this is actually not just applicable to teenagers. We're beginning to look at this for very young kids as well as adults. And I think the Maker Lab is a great example of that, or the Advanced Manufacturing Lab. Oops, I'll go back one more. In addition to our work with teens, we also, we think, can continue to serve as a catalyst for creativity and learning for very young children. And working with parents specifically to better understand how to engage and learn with their child. I mean, I think one of the things that, as we think about play, and we think about creativity, it starts with a parent understanding that's important. I mean, I think intuitively, probably many parents are out there, even if they're not reading the research, encouraging their kids to play, but it's actually one of the most important parts of a child's development. There's quite a bit of research, I think, as we all know, about play and how we can use play to stimulate the growth of a child. But again, we use the library to expose parents to that research, because a lot of that stuff is pretty simple. We know that, so what we're doing right now in Chicago is we're working with play to supercharge a child's ability to learn and create within the walls of our children's spaces. It used to be that we had sort of small tables, small chairs, and small shelves, and that was sort of the children's space in the library. We actually think we're selling ourselves a little bit short. I mean, our children's programs, or our story times as we call them, are really early literacy classes where we're modeling for parents how to engage with their child around learning and reading and play and experimentation, and now we're looking at how we can design our spaces to support the same. So we're now looking at creating spaces in our libraries that support physical play, play as objects, play, symbolic play, socio-dynamic play, and games with rules. So these different aspects of play. So as you get into it, and I'm sure for the museum folks in the room, there is incredible opportunities here. And again, for us in libraries and museums and those who operate in the fringes, we don't have the same standards in some cases that formal education do, so we actually can do that experimentation. And we are starting that now in Chicago, one of our newest initiatives. So in short, we're in a knowledge economy. Creative, smart cities will thrive and compete. Libraries, in my view, are among our most trusted and used institutions that we have. And we also have a pretty radical mission, I think, that has stood the test of time. And that as we start thinking about successful libraries, that they, in my view, they'll be successful if we can leverage this mission to make our community stronger and smarter through a more competitive and dramatic, creating more competitive and dramatic spaces. They'll do this in part, of course, by building tech skill and capacity, which you talked about, supporting entrepreneurship and innovation, serving as catalysts for creativity and learning, and I think we're just at the beginning. Libraries, I think, can help at all of this. I think we are doing some of it, but the reason I'm here is because I really want to do it with all of you. So whenever I come out and talk to folks, this work, I think, is highly collaborative, and I think that we can solve these issues together. That's it. Thank you.